Hello, this video is entitled Autobiography of a Pedagogy. I'm Cynthia McCallister. Before we dig into the content, I'll take a minute to introduce myself. I'm a former elementary school teacher. I taught elementary school in New York City and rural Maine at every grade level except fourth. I've been a professor and teacher educator for 20 years. As a professor at New York University since 1998, I've worked with pre-service and in-service teachers. I was also the founding director of the Literacy Masters program that I developed with my colleagues over a decade ago. I'm also a wife and mother of 3 children. One of my kids had a long history of serious difficulties with school. Our experiences caused more than a lot of angst, but they also motivated me to do whatever I could to understand the reasons that cause kids like him to have difficulty in school. He was the impetus of my 15-year obsession to try to make school a more successful experience for all kids, but especially those who struggle. In a lot of ways, learning culture is developed because of him. And I work in kindergarten through 12th grade New York City public school classrooms where I teach teachers and principals how to use learning culture's practices with their students. During my career as a scholar, I devoted my research agenda to the very mysteries that frustrated me as a parent and teacher. For nearly 2 decades, I've been scouring literature across the behavioral sciences to gain better insights into theories of literacy, motivation, identity, self-competence, and the nature of thinking and consciousness, among other mysteries of the human mind. I applied the new insights I gleaned from psychology and linguistics and other fields to devise ways to restructure classrooms and school systems to better support student learning, success, and happiness. And I've written articles and books describing these approaches. The way I tested and improved these practices through the years is somewhat unconventional for an academic like myself. Instead of setting up experiments and conducting controlled interventions in schools, I've worked as a practitioner in the field alongside students, teachers, and administrators. Through a process of applying theory and pragmatic logic to the challenges that arise in our practical work, I developed a range of innovative ways of doing school. Over the last 20 years, I've worked in over 20 schools on a long-term basis, mostly schools that serve high-poverty populations in both rural and urban settings, with dozens of teachers and hundreds of students. But another facet of my experience that's significant to the work I'm sharing is my background as a school child. I was fortunate to have had the opportunity to attend a university lab school. It was run by Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, the place I grew up, and provided training opportunities to pre-service teachers who attended Ball State. Even though I grew up at a time when behaviorism was at a height in education research and practice, we were somewhat protected. For the most part, my school was committed to progressive education. And by progressive, I mean that teaching in my school honored the principles of freedom of speech, thought, and movement. It honored self-determination and social cooperation. Good things, I think, for an institution that's supposed to serve the broad interests of democratic society. As a young child and pre-adolescent, I had the privilege of feeling what freedom and autonomy were like in the context of my education. In most of my classrooms, we had ample time to exercise our freedoms in the service of learning. We could usually sit where we wanted, select topics we wanted to study, and collaborate with our friends. Each week, 2 full hours were devoted to the arts, one fine arts, the other industrial arts or woodshop, and we had 2 hours a week of physical education and 2 of music. In middle school, the entire afternoon was spent in music, art, home economics, or industrial arts. My school was also committed to racial and economic integration. While over just half the students who attended the school lived in the affluent neighborhood adjacent to the university on the north side of campus, 40% of the student body came from the poor working-class neighborhood south of campus and from the city's racially diverse south side. Close friendships blossomed for the most part within racial boundaries, but students in our school danced, flirted, chatted, cheered, and played ball across race boundaries. This cultural synthesis, I would later discover, melded my worldview. Though my school was constantly hounded by the public for not adequately preparing its students academically, it served me well, and even as an adult, I continue to realize new ways the experience rewarded me. When I was 15, though, my father insisted I attend a so-called rigorous high school, and I spent the next 4 years imprisoned. From 8:25 to 3:10 each day, I was herded with the masses of my anonymous peers from one room to the next, where in each case I sat in an assigned seat in one of the ordered rows. For the first time in my educational experience, I felt the suffocation of restriction. Stifled, I sat through hours and days of unending lectures. I passed the long days drawing or writing notes to my friends when I could no longer stand to pay attention. Though the building was relatively new, for me the space within the classroom walls had a fluorescent chill. After my freshman year, once the newness had worn off and my survival instincts set in, I played hooky a lot. Sometime in my sophomore year, I discovered that a school policy permitted 17 absences each ranking period before students were failed. During my junior and senior years, I skipped school 16 times each term. This was the era of school desegregation, and though black students were bused to this North Side high school, the culture of the place never achieved the synthesis of my elementary school, where social collaborations nurtured relational connections across racial subgroups. In high school, when students were allowed the freedom to affiliate with peers during lunchtime, the black kids gathered together by the jukebox in the lobby. I could completely understand the desire to be with peers of the same culture, but I still remember at the time being struck by the feeling that this picture was amiss. Some 30 years later, I experienced that same sensibility when I began working in the middle school classrooms of the Jacob Riis School in Lower Manhattan, where ESL students were isolated together at their own tables to work away from the rest of their classmates. The drastic difference in my two school experiences, the freedom from my childhood and pre-adolescent education and the repression of high school, shaped my beliefs and commitments about the kinds of education experiences and opportunities that all children should have. Later in life, when I became an elementary teacher, the whole language movement was in full force. This movement honored many of the progressive tenets I held sacred. When in my second year of teaching I was assigned to teach kindergarten for the first time, I structured a full hour into the half-day program for my students to write. They could move about the room freely, play games that involved writing, or draw pictures as long as they scribbled or scrawled some message. At the conclusion of each writing session, my students and I would gather on the rug. I'd give over my seat to a student author, and they would read their piece to their peers and receive comments. I refrained from commenting whenever possible. This curriculum component was the heart of my kindergarten program. It was incredibly powerful to students and allowed them to learn about literacy, themselves as writers and readers, and their classmates as friends and community members. And to this day, I continue to be committed to this practice. I left the classroom after 5 years of teaching in order to enter a doctoral program at the University of Maine. While I was there, I became intrigued with sociocultural theory and its power to explain effective examples of teaching and learning that I had personally witnessed, both as a student and as a teacher. After graduating, I became a professor. When I moved to New York City in 1996 to work as an assistant professor at a university, I also began consulting in a public school in northern Manhattan where my children were enrolled. My work there was part of a new school implementation initiative supported by New Visions for Public Schools. At the Haywood Burns School, my children were the only white kids in their classrooms. My daughter was the only English speaker in hers. For the first time, my children and I were minorities in an otherwise homogeneous cultural context. The kids were mostly Spanish speakers of Dominican descent. As a consultant, I advised kindergarten through 8th grade teachers to implement the writing share in their classrooms, just as I had done when I was a teacher. I also showed them how to free up space in their reading programs to allow kids to select texts of their choosing, and how to assess reading skills in the context of authentic reading activities. In classrooms where these practices were done consistently, the students responded well, but the implementation was inconsistent overall. Though the teachers as a whole agreed to the new program I proposed, a substantial number of them either chose to implement practices of their own design, lacked classroom management skills, or especially in the middle school grades, replaced the program with test preparation activities. When I expressed my concerns about lack of program fidelity to the principal, she became defensive. But in fairness, she had a right to be defensive. This was the mid-90s after all, and the accountability movement was just beginning to get underway. Suggestions by anyone that anyone should be responsible for anything in education at the time could be taken as an offense. Community school board politics and lack of accountability to implementation undermined the reform effort and student achievement. 2 years after we enrolled in the school, by the time my son's cohort was in 3rd grade, Almost half of his classmates were referred for special education services due to gaps in achievement based on age. As both a mother and school reformer, I was heartbroken that our vision to establish a progressive school was not achieved. I felt defeated and disappointed. During my work at the Haywood Burns School, I was offered the opportunity through the Spencer Foundation to be mentored by Professor Edmund Gordon, Yale Professor Emeritus. Ed was also founding director of both the Institute for Research on the African Diaspora in the Americas and the Caribbean and the Institute of Urban and Minority Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. Under Professor Gordon's guidance, I began to read cultural and social psychology. I also read about radical empirical ethnography, a research method that recognizes the importance of the kind of knowledge that is created when a researcher participates in social practices with research subjects. Rather than discounting these insights as unobjective or tainted by personal values, this method honors the subjective insights that a researcher can only acquire through cooperative work and relationships with subjects. One aspect of Ed's work that had a significant influence on my thinking was his concept of sufficiency as a factor in equity of educational opportunity. Given established standards for learning and achievement, education is only equitable to the degree it provides sufficient opportunities to learn relative to the specific needs of each learner. The sufficiency principle is woven into the fabric of the learning cultures model. I ended my work at the Haywood Burns School in 1999 and spent the next 7 years reading psychology, working towards tenure, and having a third child. Then in 2007, I returned to work in the field in order to have the opportunity to apply new theories I'd been learning about to the progressive model I'd begun to develop when I was a teacher. In fall 2007, I had the opportunity to work at the Jacob Riis School, a high-poverty pre-K through 8th grade public school in Lower Manhattan, just adjacent to the Brooklyn Bridge. Carrie Decker, the intrepid and visionary leader of the school, asked me to come to her school for an interview. Her teachers had been using a popular readers and writers workshop approach, and students were not responding well, Carrie explained. She expressed concern that the achievement rates were declining and teachers' dependence on scripted curricula inhibited their growth of instructional expertise. When I told her about the new theory of instruction I had been developing, Carrie was interested, and she invited me to begin work right away with the teachers from kindergarten through 8th grade. Initially, I worked with all teachers in the school to implement the writing component of the model, which would become known as learning cultures. For the most part, the teachers embraced my approach. Within a few weeks, Carrie mandated that the writing program be implemented in all K-8 classrooms. The collaboration between Carrie and me to implement a strong accountability component to progressive reforms helped guarantee fidelity of implementation of our practices. This also helped us avoid the failure of implementation I had witnessed when I attempted to implement some of the same practices at the Haywood Burns School with the principal there. Our collaboration also provided a context to develop a prototype for the implementation of school-wide reforms that other schools could later follow. Like my kindergarten kids, Jacob Riis students could sit wherever they wanted in the classroom, they could work with whomever they chose, and they could write on self-selected topics in forms of their choosing. All the kids in the elementary section of the school got an hour every day to write. The middle school kids got half the program the first year because their ELA block combined reading and writing activities, but their program was revised the following year so that they had 1 hour each of reading and writing a day. Students also had the opportunity to participate in the Share, a class meeting at the end of the period when 2 students took turns reading their piece aloud to the class and then receiving feedback. Each month, every elementary student had the chance to share their writing twice. Aside from a brief 10-minute lesson, skills instruction was not permitted. Teachers conferred with students individually, at which time they provided feedback about writing, but the practice of employing small leveled or skill-focused instructional groups was abandoned. Most of the teachers at the Jacob Riis School would attest that the new writing program was such a powerful influence on students and teachers that it seemed to shift the culture of the school. Kids became motivated as writers, eager to share their writing with peers, and interested in hearing the writing of their classmates. These positive social interactions infiltrated the learning cultures of classrooms and seemed to have a positive influence on teaching and learning in general. Carey was convinced of the power of the sociocultural methods of what would become known as learning cultures and asked me to take a lead in implementing the model in the K-8 reading programs in 2008 and 9. During the 4 years of implementation at Jacob Riis, my thinking about ways to modify and improve learning cultures practices continued to be inspired by reading theory. The ideas of David Olson, the renowned cultural psychologist and literacy scholar, were particularly influential. David's close involvement with the Jacob Riis project was supported by a research grant through New York University, which enabled him to visit the school several times to provide guidance and insight in ways to improve our program. Carey, the teachers, and I could tell that the kids were succeeding in ways they had not before. The school report cards indicated strong patterns of growth. But to test out the effectiveness of the program, I conducted a comparative study of 10 other kindergarten through 8th grade schools, which included 5,000 students, to see how our reform stood up to conventional practices. The data showed that the elementary students made statistically significant gains of a large magnitude on English language arts and math state assessments the first year of implementation in 2007 and 8, and these gains were maintained through the next 4 years of the study. In the second year of implementation, after the practices were implemented with greater fidelity, students in the middle school also made statistically significant gains in math and ELA, and they too maintained these gains through the remaining 3 years of the study. Since the Jacob Riis pilot, the learning cultures model has been implemented in 8 other schools where similar achievement gains have been repeated. Learning cultures is the product of a lifetime of experience on my part as the creator. The specific practices have taken over 20 years for me to develop. But it's also a product of over half a century of new insights from the behavioral sciences and a long progression of philosophical ideas about thinking, learning, and human existence. To me, learning cultures is like a glacier. It's moved very slowly. But like a glacier, learning cultures has the power to transform the landscapes of traditional schooling. Don McLean sings, "All roads lead to where we stand." It's true. Of all the possible roads we might have taken, the ones we chose finally brought us here. What were the roads you took in order to get to this destination? How did your journey influence your beliefs and commitments about learning and teaching? How did you come to learning cultures? I've taken this lecture to introduce myself. In doing so, you probably notice how I selectively lifted memories from my past and used them to interpret meaning from the work that I do. This is what psychologists mean when they refer to the creative use of memory. Our memories are not static or inert, like files on a computer that are in the same state you left them when you last saved and closed the document. On the contrary, our memories change and evolve as we refer to them again and again, imbuing them with new significance and relating them to new situations. We have a lot of control over changing the very nature of the way we think about how we've experienced our past lives. We have the power to make our memories work for us, to help us gain greater insight and understanding about who we are and what we hope for and what we believe is possible. We use narrative to make sense of our memories of our experiences, literally revising and recomposing our identities through the process of narrating new visions of ourselves through the stories we tell and retell. So I want to invite you to use your memory creatively. Take some time to think about your educational experiences and your teaching experiences.